December 1885, Salt Lake Valley. Snow falls thick across the Rockies as Samuel Morrison, the richest cattle rancher in 3 counties, collapses in his barn with mountain fever burning through his veins. His 1,000 head of cattle face certain death in the brutal winter storm, and his closest neighbors are miles away. But Sarah Beth Williams, the poor widow living in a shack on the edge of his property, sees the smoke stop rising from his chimney. She knows what that means. With only her 2 young children and an empty pantry, Sarah Beth makes a choice that defies all logic. She'll trek through the blizzard twice daily to feed and water Samuel's massive herd. For 3 weeks, while he fights for his life, she fights to save everything he's built. She has no idea that Samuel Morrison isn't just any rancher. He's the secret son of the territory's most powerful railroad baron, a man who abandoned his fortune to build something honest with his own hands. When Samuel finally recovers, he discovers what this mysterious woman has done. But why would a stranger risk everything for him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Beth pulled her threadbare shawl tighter as she peered through the frost-covered window of her 1-room cabin. The Morrison place sat a 1/4 mile across the valley, its grand ranch house dark against the white landscape. For 3 days now, no smoke had risen from Samuel Morrison's chimney. No lantern light had flickered in his windows come evening. Most telling of all, she could hear the cattle lowing in distress, their calls carrying on the bitter wind. Her 8-year-old daughter Emma looked up from mending a worn sock by the dying embers of their own meager fire. "Mama, what's that awful sound?" "The Morrison cattle," Sarah Beth murmured, her breath fogging the glass. "They're calling for feed." 6-year-old Joshua abandoned his carved wooden horse and pressed against her side. "Why doesn't Mr. Morrison feed them?" She'd heard talk in town of mountain fever striking isolated homesteads. The sickness came fast and hit hard, leaving strong men delirious and helpless for weeks. Some never recovered at all. "Emma, help Joshua into his coat," Sarah Beth said suddenly, turning from the window. "We're going to check on Mr. Morrison." Emma's eyes widened. "Mama, we can't. Papa always said we shouldn't bother the rich folk." "Your papa was a good man, but sometimes helping neighbors matters more than minding our place." Sarah Beth reached for her husband's old rifle, checking that it was loaded. The weapon felt heavy in her small hands, but the wolves would be drawn to the scent of distressed cattle soon enough. The wind cut through their patched clothing as they trudged across the snow-covered field. Sarah Beth carried Joshua when his short legs faltered, while Emma struggled gamely alongside them. The Morrison ranch house loomed larger as they approached, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Sarah Beth knocked firmly on the front door. No answer. She tried again, calling out, "Mr. Morrison? Are you well, sir?" Only silence greeted them. Moving around to the kitchen entrance, she tested the door handle. It turned easily. Inside, the house felt cold as a tomb, though thankfully warmer than the howling wind outside. Dirty dishes sat abandoned on the table, and the remains of what looked like a hastily prepared meal lay spoiled on the counter. "Mr. Morrison?" she called again, her voice echoing in the spacious rooms. A weak groan answered from somewhere deeper in the house. Following the sound, Sarah Beth found herself at the foot of a grand staircase. Another groan, definitely from the upper floor. "Emma, you and Joshua wait by the kitchen fire. I'll be right back." She climbed the stairs, her worn boots silent on the thick carpet. The master bedroom door stood ajar, and inside she found Samuel Morrison barely conscious, tangled in sweat-soaked bedsheets. His face burned with fever, his breathing shallow and labored. "Mr. Morrison?" she said softly, approaching the bed. "I'm Sarah Beth Williams. I live across the valley." His eyes opened briefly, unfocused and glassy. "Water," he whispered. She found a pitcher on the washstand and helped him drink, supporting his head with surprising gentleness. For all his wealth and imposing reputation, he looked vulnerable as a child in his sickness. "Your cattle need tending," she told him, though she doubted he understood. "I'll see they're fed." Back downstairs, she gathered her children close. The enormity of what she was contemplating settled over her like the winter storm outside. 1,000 head of cattle, feed and water twice daily. 3 miles round trip through snow that already reached her knees and showed no signs of stopping. But the alternative was watching valuable animals die of neglect while their owner fought for his life. Despite their different circumstances, they were neighbors. In this harsh country, that meant something. "Come," she told her children, "we have work to do." The sound of hoofbeats against frozen ground reached Sarah before she saw the rider cresting the hill. She set down her water bucket and shielded her eyes against the morning sun, watching as a man on horseback approached her modest cabin. Few visitors came this way, especially not this early, and those who did rarely brought good news. The rider was young, perhaps 16, with the lean build of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. His horse's breath formed white clouds in the crisp December air as he pulled up near her porch. "Ma'am, you Sarah Mitchell?" His voice carried the nervous edge of someone delivering urgent news. "I am." Sarah wiped her hands on her worn apron, studying the boy's face. "What brings you out here so early, son?" "Name's Tom Brennan, ma'am. I work for Mr. Whitmore up at the Circle W ranch." He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "Mr. Whitmore's taken real sick, and his foreman sent me to find you. Says you know about healing and such." Sarah's breath caught. Jacob Whitmore. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in the valley knew of the wealthy rancher who'd built an empire from nothing. She'd seen him in town a handful of times, a tall man with steel-grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. But she'd never spoken to him, never imagined their worlds would intersect. "I'm no doctor," she said carefully. "Dr. Patterson in town." "Already been, ma'am. Doc's down with the same fever that's got Mr. Whitmore. Started 3 days ago. High fever, chills, can't keep nothing down." Tom's words tumbled out in a rush. "Foreman says you helped the Hendricks family when their baby took sick last spring. Says you got herbs and know how that might help." Sarah's mind raced. The Hendricks baby had suffered from a different ailment entirely, but she had managed to break the child's fever with willow bark tea and careful nursing. Still, Jacob Whitmore was practically a stranger, and a wealthy Mormon rancher at that. Her late husband had harbored deep suspicions about the Mormon settlers, though Sarah had always found them to be decent enough folk. "How bad is he?" she asked. "Bad enough that Mr. Garrett, that's the foreman, sent me riding before dawn to find you. Says Mr. Whitmore was talking out of his head most of the night." Tom's young face was etched with worry. "Ma'am, I know it ain't my place to say, but Mr. Whitmore's a good man, fair to his workers, generous to folks in need. If you could just take a look." Sarah glanced back at her cabin, where her own meager breakfast waited on the table. She had work to do, mending to finish, eggs to collect, a dozen small tasks that filled her days and earned her enough coins to survive. But the image of a man burning with fever, perhaps dying alone, tugged at something deep within her. "Let me gather some things," she said finally. She moved quickly through her cabin, collecting her small store of medicinal herbs, willow bark, chamomile, elderflower, and the few remedies she'd learned from her grandmother. Her hands shook slightly as she packed them into a worn leather satchel. What was she thinking? Jacob Whitmore surely had resources far beyond her simple knowledge. Yet if the town doctor was also ill— "I don't have a horse," Sarah admitted, feeling the familiar sting of her reduced circumstances. "I'll have to ride double with you." The boy's cheeks reddened. "Yes, ma'am. Of course." The ride to the Circle W took nearly an hour across rolling hills that gradually gave way to the most prosperous-looking rangeland Sarah had ever seen. Whitmore's cattle dotted the landscape, healthy and well-fed despite the approaching winter. Fence lines ran straight and true, and the buildings that came into view spoke of substantial wealth. The ranch house itself was a sprawling affair of timber and stone, far grander than anything Sarah had imagined. Several men waited on the wide porch, their faces grave. One stepped forward as Tom helped Sarah dismount, a weathered man with silver at his temples and the easy authority of someone used to managing both land and men. "Mrs. Mitchell? I'm Clay Garrett, foreman here." Much obliged you came." His handshake was firm, his eyes grateful. "Mr. Whitmore's upstairs. Been 3 days now since the fever took hold, and he's getting worse." Sarah squared her shoulders, pushing down her nervousness. "Take me to him." As they climbed the polished wooden stairs, Sarah wondered what she would find in the room above. More importantly, she wondered if her simple knowledge would be enough to help a man whose world was so far removed from her own. Outside, snow had begun to fall, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the lowing of cattle that would need tending regardless of their owner's fate. The wind had teeth that morning, cutting through the canyon walls with a vengeance that made even the hardy scrub oaks bend low. Sarah wrapped her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down the rocky slope toward the Blackwood Ranch, her breath forming small clouds that vanished as quickly as her resolve threatened to. She'd spent half the night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with doubt. What business did a woman like her have offering help to Jacob Blackwood? The man owned half the territory, commanded respect from every rancher within 100 miles, and could buy her entire property with what he probably spent on feed in a month. But those cattle, she'd seen the signs even from her distant ridge, the way they clustered together, heads hanging low, the stillness in the air that spoke of sickness creeping through the herd like smoke through dry grass. The Blackwood spread opened before her like something from a fever dream. Even in winter, even with the shadow of illness hanging over it, the place spoke of prosperity that made her throat tight with old envy and newer worry. The main house rose 3 stories against the mountain backdrop, its windows gleaming like watching eyes, corrals spread out in neat geometric patterns, most empty now as the sick cattle had been moved to isolation pens further from the house. A man emerged from the largest barn as she approached, his hat pulled low against the wind. Not Jacob. This one moved with the careful efficiency of hired help, though his clothes were better than anything Sarah had worn in years. "Ma'am." He touched his hat brim, his eyes taking in her patched coat and worn boots with a neutrality that somehow felt worse than outright judgment. "You'll be wanting the main house, I expect. Kitchen doors around back." Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks. "I'm not here for charity work. I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood about his cattle." The man's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "About the cattle? That's right. Ma'am, with respect, Mr. Blackwood's got the best veterinarian in 3 territories coming out from Salt Lake City. Don't reckon he needs—" 3 days. Sarah's voice came out harder than she'd intended. "That veterinarian will need 3 days minimum to get here, maybe more with this weather. How many head you figure to lose while you wait?" The ranch hand's expression shifted, something sharper moving behind his eyes. "What makes you think you know anything about what's ailing them cattle?" Before Sarah could answer, another voice cut through the morning air, rough with exhaustion and something that might have been pain. "Let her through, Martinez." Jacob Blackwood stood in the barn doorway, and Sarah felt her breath catch despite everything. Even obviously ill, even with fever bright in his dark eyes and exhaustion carved into the lines of his face, he carried himself with an authority that seemed to bend the very air around him. His shirt was wrinkled, his usually perfectly groomed beard showing signs of neglect, but his presence filled the space between them like heat from a forge. "Mrs. Campbell." He stepped out of the barn's shadow, moving carefully as if each step cost him. "Didn't expect to see you on my land." "Mr. Blackwood." She straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "I believe your cattle have blackleg. If I'm right, you'll lose half your herd before that veterinarian arrives." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, calculation, or maybe just the fever that was clearly burning through him. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious disease." They stood in the cold morning air, taking each other's measure. Sarah could feel Martinez watching them both, could sense other ranch hands emerging from buildings to observe this strange tableau. The widow Campbell, worn thin by 2 hard winters, facing off with the territory's cattle king while sickness threatened everything he'd built. "What makes you so certain?" Jacob's voice had gone quiet, dangerous in its very softness. Lost my husband's small herd to it 3 years back. Learned the signs the hard way. The words came easier than she'd expected, carrying less sting than they once had. Starts with the lameness, cattle favoring one leg. Then the swelling, hot to the touch. Without treatment, the tissue dies and the animal follows. Jacob was silent for a long moment, his fever-bright gaze never leaving her face. Around them the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the distant lowing of sick animals. "Show me," he said finally. Sarah nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment, the place where her small knowledge would either prove its worth or reveal itself as the desperate gamble of a woman with nothing left to lose. She followed Jacob Blackwood toward the isolation pens, acutely aware of Martinez and the other hands trailing behind them like a jury waiting to render judgment. Everything balanced on what they would find among those suffering cattle and on whether Jacob would trust the word of a woman who had already lost everything once before. The wind carried the scent of snow as Miriam guided her mare through the narrow canyon that led to the Thorn Ranch. She'd risen before dawn, her hands trembling as she'd packed what little medical supplies she could spare, willow bark tea, honey, and the precious bottle of laudanum she'd been saving for emergencies. If what young Timothy had described was true, Samuel Thorne was fighting for his life while his cattle faced certain death in the coming storm. The imposing ranch house emerged from the morning mist like something from a dream. Even in her dire circumstances, Miriam couldn't help but marvel at the sight. The main house was built of honey-colored stone, with a wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, a massive barn, several bunkhouses, and corrals that seemed to stretch for miles. This was wealth beyond anything she'd ever known, yet now it all hung in the balance. Timothy burst from the barn as she approached, relief flooding his young face. "Mrs. Fletcher, thank the Lord you've come. He's gotten worse in the night." Miriam dismounted quickly, gathering her supplies. "The other men?" "3 more took sick yesterday evening. They're in the bunkhouse, burning with fever." Timothy's voice cracked with worry. "I don't know what to do about the cattle. There's near 1,000 head, and with this storm coming..." The interior of the house spoke of refined taste and substantial means. Persian rugs covered polished wooden floors, and oil paintings adorned the walls. But luxury meant nothing in the face of illness. Timothy led her up a grand staircase to the master bedroom, where the man she'd come to help lay unconscious beneath heavy quilts. Miriam's breath caught as she saw Samuel Thorne for the first time. Even ravaged by fever, he was undeniably handsome. Dark hair damp with perspiration, strong features drawn with pain, and broad shoulders that spoke of a man accustomed to physical labor despite his wealth. She pushed aside such inappropriate thoughts and moved to his bedside, pressing her palm to his forehead. The fever burned like a forge. His breathing was shallow, labored, and when she lifted his eyelids, his pupils were dilated and unfocused. She'd seen this before, the typhoid that had swept through Salt Lake City 2 summers prior. If that's what this was, time was running desperately short. "Help me get him sitting up," she instructed Timothy. "We need to get fluids into him." For the next hour, she worked methodically. She prepared willow bark tea to fight the fever, mixed honey with water for sustenance, and carefully administered small amounts of laudanum for the pain that had him moaning even in unconsciousness. Timothy proved an able assistant, following her instructions without question despite his youth. "You'll need to do this every 2 hours, she explained, showing him how to check Samuel's temperature and administer the remedies. "Don't let him get dehydrated, even if you have to force the liquid between his lips." Timothy nodded gravely. "What about the cattle and the other men?" Miriam looked out the bedroom window at the darkening sky. Snow was already beginning to fall in fat, lazy flakes that spoke of a serious storm to come. "I'll tend to the men first. Then we'll assess the situation with the livestock." The scene in the bunkhouse was grim. 3 men lay in various stages of the fever, 2 conscious but weak, 1 delirious with the heat of it. She moved between them efficiently, drawing on skills learned from necessity over the years. Motherhood and widowhood had taught her to be both gentle and practical in the face of crisis. As she worked, the conscious men told her about the cattle. They were scattered across the winter pasture, vulnerable to the storm and already showing signs of distress without proper tending. The implications were clear. Without immediate action, Samuel Thorne would lose everything. When she finally emerged from the bunkhouse, the snow was falling steadily. Timothy waited by the barn, his face etched with worry that seemed far too mature for his years. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said quietly, "I can't manage them all alone. The cattle, they need to be brought to shelter, but there's just too many." Miriam stared out at the vast expanse of Thorne's ranch, white flakes already beginning to obscure the distant mountains. Every instinct told her to return home, to see to her own family's needs before the storm trapped her here. But the image of Samuel Thorne's fever-racked face lingered in her mind, along with the trust she'd seen in Timothy's young eyes. She thought of her own desperate circumstances, of the bills mounting and winter closing in. Then she thought of what her late husband would have done, what simple Christian charity demanded. "Then we'd better get started," she said. The morning air bit sharp against Martha's face as she made her way back to the main house, her arms laden with eggs from the henhouse. 3 days had passed since she'd taken on caring for the livestock, and exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders. But the animals were fed, watered, and accounted for, every last one. She pushed through the kitchen door to find Dr. Henley bent over the stove, stirring something that smelled of herbs and steam. He looked up as she entered, his weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed deeper than when he'd first arrived. "How is he?" Martha asked, setting the eggs on the wooden counter. "The fever broke an hour ago." Henley's voice carried cautious relief. "He's been asking for water, which is a good sign. The crisis has passed, I believe." Martha felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Thank the Lord. Indeed. The doctor studied her with keen eyes. "When did you last sleep, Mrs. Coleman? Properly, I mean." She waved off his concern, though truth was she couldn't remember. The past 3 days had blurred together in a haze of dawn-to-dusk work, checking on animals, mending fences, hauling feed and water. "I'm managing fine." "You're managing remarkably," Henley said firmly. "I've been watching from the window when I can. That bull of his, Caesar, he's been docile as a lamb with you. I've seen grown men give that animal a wide berth." Martha shrugged, though warmth spread through her at the praise. "Animals know when you're trying to help them." "It's more than that." The doctor turned back to his pot, but his tone remained thoughtful. "You've got a gift. This ranch, it's been running smooth as clockwork while Jonathan's been laid up. That's no small feat." Before Martha could respond, a weak voice called from the bedroom. "Doctor!" Henley hurried toward the sound, and after a moment's hesitation, Martha followed. She'd avoided the sick room these past days, partly from propriety and partly from fear of seeing the strong man she'd met reduced to something frail and broken. Jonathan Whitmore lay propped against pillows, pale as fresh snow but undeniably alert. His dark eyes found hers immediately. "Mrs. Coleman." His voice was rough with disuse but steady. "Dr. Henley tells me you've been managing things." Heat crept up Martha's neck. Standing in his bedroom felt improper, even with the doctor present. "Just seeing to the necessities, Mr. Whitmore. Nothing more than any neighbor would do." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Any neighbor would have let my cattle starve and my horses run wild." "Don't diminish what you've done." "The fever's broken," Dr. Henley interjected, "but you'll need several more days of rest." "No arguments," he added as Jonathan started to protest. "You nearly died, son. Your body needs time to recover." Jonathan's jaw tightened with frustration. "Christmas is in 8 days. I have obligations." "Your obligations can wait," Martha found herself saying. Both men looked at her in surprise, and she felt her cheeks burn. "I mean, the ranch will keep. The animals are all well cared for. You can't mean to continue." "I can, and I will. The words came out stronger than she'd intended. At least until you're back on your feet. Jonathan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Why? The simple question caught her off guard. Why was she doing this? Why risk her reputation, her limited energy, her time away from her own small holding? The answer that came to her lips surprised her with its honesty. Because it's Christmas, she said quietly, and because you would have done the same. Something shifted in his eyes, a softening she hadn't expected. I owe you a debt I can't possibly repay. You don't owe me anything. Martha stepped back toward the doorway. I should let you rest, Mrs. Coleman. His voice stopped her. When this is over, when I'm well, I'd like to speak with you about arrangements. Arrangements? Compensation. For your work here. Martha's spine stiffened. I told you, I don't want your charity. Not charity, he said quickly. Employment, fair wage for fair work. His eyes held hers steadily. I've never seen the ranch run better. That's not sentiment talking, it's business sense. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities Martha didn't dare examine too closely. A steady income, security, respect. We'll discuss it when you're well, she said finally. As she turned to leave, she caught Dr. Henley watching her with something that might have been approval. Outside the bedroom, the house felt different somehow, less like a stranger's domain and more like what? She couldn't name the feeling, but it settled around her shoulders like a warm shawl against the winter cold. Through the kitchen window, she could see snow beginning to fall again, dusting the pastures where cattle moved peacefully in the distance. Her cattle now, at least for a few more days. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Miriam loaded the last of her meager supplies into the wagon. Her hands trembled slightly as she secured the rope around her few remaining sacks of grain that should have lasted through January, now being gambled on a desperate plan that might save or doom them all. "Mama, are you certain about this?" Sarah asked, her breath visible in the crisp December air. At 15, she possessed a wisdom beyond her years, born from too many nights of watching their mother calculate and recalculate their dwindling resources by lamplight. "Certain is a luxury we can't afford," Miriam replied, checking the harness one final time. "But sometimes the Lord asks us to step forward in faith, even when we cannot see the path clearly." The ride to the Whitmore Ranch felt both endless and far too brief. With each mile, Miriam's resolve wavered like a candle flame in winter wind. What right did she have to presume she could manage 1,000 head of cattle? She'd kept their small flock of sheep alive through sheer stubbornness and prayer, but this was different. This was a fortune in livestock belonging to a man she barely knew, a man whose very reputation made grown men step carefully. The ranch house came into view, its imposing stone facade speaking of prosperity she could scarcely imagine. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and she could see several hands moving about the corrals, their movements purposeful but clearly lacking direction. Cattle dotted the distant pastures like scattered ink blots against the brown winter grass. Dr. Morrison met her at the gate, his face grave beneath his worn black hat. "Mrs. Blake, I confess I'm surprised to see you here." "I've come about Mr. Whitmore's proposition," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "His livestock need tending, and I have some experience with such matters." The doctor's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Ma'am, with respect, Ezra Whitmore owns more cattle than most men see in a lifetime. This isn't a matter of nursing a sick calf or mending fence." "Perhaps not," Miriam conceded, climbing down from her wagon with practiced ease. "But cattle are cattle, and they need water, feed, and someone who notices when they're suffering. I may not have his wealth, but I know suffering when I see it, in animals and people alike." Something in her tone must have penetrated his skepticism. Dr. Morrison studied her for a long moment, taking in her patched but clean dress, her worn boots that had seen countless dawns in pastures, her calloused hands that spoke of honest labor. "He's worse today," the doctor said finally. "The fever's got him talking to people who aren't there, calling out orders for roundups that happened 20 years ago. But in his lucid moments, He keeps asking about the cattle. It's eating at him something fierce. Then let me ease his mind, Miriam said. What harm could there be in trying? They found Thomas Hendricks, Whitmore's foreman, standing in the main corral, looking like a man drowning in responsibility. His relief at seeing Dr. Morrison was palpable, but confusion clouded his features when he spotted Miriam. Doc, thank the Lord. The boss was asking for you again, and the men are getting spooked. Some are already talking about heading to town for the winter, leaving the stock to fend for themselves. Thomas, this is Mrs. Blake, Dr. Morrison said carefully. She's here about the cattle situation. The foreman's weathered face cycled through surprise, skepticism, and something approaching desperation. Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but we've got more cattle here than I've ever managed, Miriam finished. You're right. But I've kept livestock alive through drought, blizzards, and wolves. I know the signs of disease, I can spot a weak animal from 100 yards, and I don't panic when things go sideways. Most importantly, I'm here and I'm willing. Thomas glanced between her and the doctor, clearly struggling with the unprecedented situation. The boss specifically said no charity. He was mighty particular about that. This isn't charity, Miriam said firmly. I expect payment for my work, enough to keep my family fed through winter, fair wages for honest labor. If your employer lives, he can decide if my efforts were worthwhile. If not, she let the words hang in the cold air. The foreman removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. Lord help us all, he muttered. Ma'am, can you start today? We've got cattle scattered across 3 sections, and with this cold snap coming, they'll need to be brought closer to the ranch buildings. I can start now, Miriam replied, already mentally cataloguing what she'd observed during the ride-in. But I'll need men who'll follow orders without question, even from a woman. Can you guarantee that? Thomas looked at her with something approaching respect. Ma'am, if you can keep this operation running until the boss recovers, I'll make damn sure they listen. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Sarah made her way toward the main house, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. She'd been up since before dawn, checking on the animals and ensuring the water troughs hadn't frozen overnight. The fever had broken in most of the remaining cattle, and she allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. She found Ezra in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee with hands that still trembled slightly. His color had improved significantly over the past few days, though he remained gaunt and weak. The proud rancher she'd first encountered seemed diminished somehow, as if the illness had stripped away more than just his physical strength. You shouldn't be up, she said, moving to take the coffee pot from his unsteady grip. Dr. Morrison said you need at least another week of rest. I've rested enough, he replied, though he didn't resist when she guided him to a chair. I need to see what's left of my herd. Sarah busied herself with the coffee, choosing her words carefully. We lost 63 head total. The rest are recovering well. Your foreman, Tom, has been invaluable. I couldn't have managed without him. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the numbers. She'd expected anger, perhaps accusations about her methods or decisions. Instead, when he spoke, his voice was heavy with something she hadn't heard from him before, vulnerability. My grandfather started this ranch with 12 head of cattle and a dream, he said, staring out the window toward the pastures. My father built it into something substantial. And I... He trailed off, shaking his head. You saved it, Sarah said firmly, setting a cup of coffee before him. If you hadn't gotten help when you did, you would have lost everything. 63 head is a significant loss, but it's not the end. Help from a woman whose husband I once considered beneath my notice, he said quietly. The irony isn't lost on me, Mrs. Mitchell. My position, Ezra repeated with a bitter laugh. What good is position when it prevents you from seeing the worth in decent people? Your husband was a better man than I gave him credit for, and you, he met her eyes directly, you've shown me kindness I'm not certain I deserve. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the intensity of his gaze. There was something different about him since the fever broke, as if the illness had burned away some invisible barrier he'd maintained. Any neighbor would have done the same. No, he said simply. They wouldn't have. Most would have watched from a safe distance and offered their condolences afterward. The truth of his words settled uncomfortably between them. She had taken an enormous risk, one that could have cost her everything if the fever had spread to her own animals or if she'd fallen ill herself. But sitting here now, seeing the gratitude in his dark eyes, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. "I should check on the herd," she said, standing abruptly. The intimacy of the moment felt dangerous somehow, like standing too close to a fire. "Sarah." The sound of her Christian name on his lips stopped her at the door. He'd never used it before. It had always been Mrs. Mitchell with careful formality. "I owe you more than I can repay." She turned back to find him standing, despite his weakness, pride, and something else she couldn't name warring in his expression. "The debt is paid already," she replied. "Your recovery is payment enough." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Somewhere in the midst of fighting for his livestock and nursing him through his illness, something had shifted. The stern, unapproachable rancher had become simply Ezra, a man who'd shown her unexpected vulnerability and was looking at her now with an expression that made her pulse quicken. Outside, the December wind carried the promise of snow, and she pulled her shawl tighter as she walked toward the pastures. Christmas was only days away, a fact she'd barely registered in the chaos of the past weeks. She wondered what the holiday would bring, whether Ezra would be strong enough to resume full control of his ranch, whether she would return to her small homestead and the quiet loneliness that had become her constant companion. The cattle looked up as she approached, their eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks. They were survivors, these animals, tougher than they appeared. Rather like their owner, she thought, and perhaps like herself as well. The fever had taken its toll, but what remained might prove stronger for having endured the trial. As she checked the water troughs, she couldn't shake the memory of Ezra speaking her name, or the way something in her chest had tightened at the sound. The dawn light filtered through frost-covered windows as Sarah checked on Ezra for what felt like the 100th time that night. His fever had broken just before sunrise, and for the first time in days, his breathing came steady and deep. She pressed her palm against his forehead, still warm but no longer burning. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to God or the medicine or some force she couldn't name, she wasn't certain. A soft knock at the door interrupted her prayers. She opened it to find Dr. Henley, his medical bag in hand and exhaustion etched across his weathered face. "How is he?" the doctor asked, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Better. The fever broke about an hour ago." Dr. Henley nodded, moving past her to examine his patient. Sarah watched as he checked Ezra's pulse, listened to his breathing, and tested his temperature with practiced efficiency. "Remarkable," he murmured, straightening. "I've seen grown men half his age succumb to what he's fought off. You've done good work here, Mrs. Mitchell." The praise should have warmed her, but Sarah found herself thinking of the cattle still scattered across the valley, of the work left undone, of the precarious balance she'd been maintaining between Ezra's care and his ranch. The livestock. "Can wait another day," Dr. Henley interrupted firmly. "You look ready to collapse yourself. When did you last eat a proper meal, or sleep more than an hour at a stretch?" Sarah couldn't remember. The past few days had blurred together in a haze of cold compresses, bitter medicine, and constant vigilance. She'd survived on coffee and whatever scraps she could manage between caring for Ezra. "I'll be fine," she said automatically. "No, you won't." The doctor's tone brooked no argument. "I'm prescribing rest for both my patients. Ezra will sleep most of today. His body needs time to recover, and you need the same." As if summoned by their conversation, Ezra's eyes fluttered open. His gaze, though still weak, held clarity for the first time since the fever had taken hold. "Sarah?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. She was at his side instantly, kneeling beside the makeshift bed. "I'm here. How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by my own bulls." A ghost of his familiar smile touched his lips. "But alive, thanks to you." Dr. Henley cleared his throat. "Mr. Hartwell, You gave us quite a scare. Another few hours and—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Ezra's eyes found Sarah's again. "You stayed." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Of course I stayed." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. She looked away, suddenly aware of how she must appear, hair unkempt, dress wrinkled from days of wear, dark circles beneath her eyes. The cattle. Ezra tried to push himself up on his elbows. "The winter feed is being managed," Sarah said firmly, pressing him back down. "Marcus and I have been handling what we can. Everything else will keep." Dr. Henley packed his instruments away. "I'll check on you both this evening. Mrs. Mitchell, I mean what I said about rest. Mr. Hartwell, you're not to leave this bed for at least 2 days. Doctor's orders." After he left, an unusual quiet settled over the house. For days, the rooms had been filled with the sounds of illness, labored breathing, fevered muttering, the constant bustle of care. Now, in the peaceful silence, Sarah felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her like a heavy quilt. "You should eat something," Ezra said, watching her sway slightly on her feet. "There's good ham in the smokehouse, eggs from the henhouse." Sarah nodded, though the thought of food made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. She'd been running on nerves and determination for so long that she'd forgotten what normal appetite felt like. She made her way to the kitchen on unsteady legs, aware of Ezra's concerned gaze following her. The simple act of preparing a meal, slicing bread, frying eggs, brewing fresh coffee, felt almost foreign after days of focused care. When she returned to the main room with a tray, she found Ezra watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sit with me," he said quietly. She hesitated. The boundaries that had defined their arrangement seemed blurred now, shifted by the intimacy of illness and care. She'd seen him at his most vulnerable, had been the sole barrier between him and death. Such experiences changed things in ways that couldn't be easily categorized or explained. Finally, she settled in the chair beside his bed, the same chair where she'd kept vigil through the long, dark hours. They shared the simple meal in comfortable silence, and Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of having saved something precious, of having been exactly where she needed to be when it mattered most. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the valley in pristine white, as if the world itself was starting fresh. The fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving Jacob hollow-eyed and weak as a newborn calf. He drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversation between his children and glimpses of a woman's figure moving efficiently through his bedroom. When he finally surfaced fully, the winter sun was streaming through windows that someone had cleaned until they sparkled. "You're awake." Sarah's voice came from the chair beside his bed, where she sat mending one of his shirts with careful, practiced stitches. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a loose bun that suggested she'd been here for days rather than hours. "How long?" His voice came out as a croak, his throat raw from the fever's grip. 3 days. Doc Morrison said it was touch and go for a while. She set down her sewing and reached for a pitcher of water, pouring him a glass. "Your children were scared." Jacob struggled to sit up, his head spinning with the effort. Sarah was beside him instantly, her hands steady on his shoulders as she helped him lean against the headboard. Her touch was gentle but impersonal, the kind of care she might give to any injured creature. "The cattle," he managed, accepting the water gratefully. "Are fine. Ben's been handling them with some of the other ranchers' sons. Your neighbors came by to help." She returned to her chair, maintaining a careful distance. "They think highly of you." He studied her face in the afternoon light, noting the exhaustion there and something else, a wariness that hadn't been present before his illness. "You stayed." Someone needed to. Her answer was matter-of-fact, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. "Mary tried to help, but she's only 14, and Daniel—" She trailed off, picking up her sewing again. "Where is Daniel?" "In town with the Andersons. I thought it best, with you being so sick." Her needle moved in quick, efficient strokes. Children don't need to see their father like that. Jacob felt a stab of something deeper than gratitude. This woman had stepped into his home during a crisis, cared for him through the worst of his fever, and shielded his son from fear. Yet she spoke of it as if she'd simply completed a necessary chore. "Sarah." He waited until she looked up. "Why did you really stay?" For a moment, something flickered across her features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Then the careful mask slipped back into place. "I told you, someone needed to. That's not what I meant." She set down her sewing with deliberate precision. "I'm not sure what you're asking, Mr. Whitmore." "Jacob. And I think you know exactly what I'm asking." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Outside, they could hear the sound of voices in the yard. Mary talking to someone, probably Ben returning from checking the herd. "I lost my husband to a fever just like this one," Sarah said finally, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear. "He died alone because I was too proud to let the neighbors help, too stubborn to admit I couldn't manage everything myself." She smoothed the fabric in her lap with trembling fingers. I wouldn't let that happen again, not if I could prevent it." Jacob felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Thomas made his choices, and I made mine." She stood abruptly, gathering her sewing supplies. "You're better now. That's what matters." "Sarah, wait." He tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't support him yet. "Please." She paused at the doorway, her back straight and unyielding. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. For staying, for caring for my children, for—" He searched for words that seemed inadequate. "For bringing me back." When she turned, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You brought yourself back, Jacob. I just made sure you weren't alone while you did it." The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted them, and Mary's voice called out, "Pa, are you awake? Mrs. Fletcher, Ben says the cattle are all accounted for and—" She appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up at the sight of her father sitting up. "Pa!" Jacob opened his arms as his daughter rushed to him, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair as she buried her face against his shoulder. Over her head, he met Sarah's gaze. "I should go," Sarah said quietly. "Let you rest with your family." "No," Mary said suddenly, pulling back from her father. "Please don't go yet, Mrs. Fletcher. Daniel's coming back tonight, and we were going to make a proper dinner to celebrate Pa getting well." Sarah hesitated, and Jacob saw the moment when her careful composure nearly cracked. She was as alone as he was, he realized. "Perhaps more so." "Please," he said simply, "stay." The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered pasture as Sarah adjusted the rope around her waist, preparing for another day of hauling feed to the scattered cattle. 3 days had passed since she'd taken charge of the Whitmore ranch, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her hands, raw from the cold and constant work, trembled as she secured the knots. "Mrs. Harper, you shouldn't be doing this alone." She turned to find Thomas emerging from the main house, his face pale but his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. He wore a heavy coat over his nightclothes, and she could see the effort it took him just to stand upright. "Mr. Whitmore, you should be in bed." Sarah dropped the rope and hurried toward him. "The fever may have broken, but you're still weak as a newborn calf. Those cattle are my responsibility." His voice carried the stubborn edge she was beginning to recognize. "I can't lie there knowing you're risking your life for my livestock. And I can't let them starve knowing I have the strength to prevent it." She met his gaze steadily. "Besides, someone needs to check on that heifer in the north pasture. She was favoring her left front leg yesterday." Thomas studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. "Then we'll go together," he said finally. "I know these animals better than anyone, and you know the work that needs doing. Between us, we might actually accomplish something." Sarah wanted to protest, but the practical part of her mind recognized the wisdom in his words. She'd been guessing at much of the ranch work, relying on instinct and determination rather than knowledge. Very well, she conceded. But at the first sign you're pushing too hard, I'm dragging you back to that house myself. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I don't doubt you would. They worked in comfortable silence for the first hour, Thomas directing her to the spots where feed was most needed, while he handled the lighter tasks his recovering body could manage. Sarah found herself stealing glances at him as they moved from pasture to pasture, noting how naturally he moved among the animals, speaking to them in low, soothing tones. You really love this place, don't you? She asked, as they paused near a cluster of cottonwoods to rest. It's all I've ever known, he replied, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. My father built this ranch from nothing, and I always thought I'd pass it on to my sons. His expression grew distant. Before the fever took them, Sarah felt her chest tighten. She'd lost her own husband, but the thought of losing children was almost unbearable. How do you bear it? Some days I'm not sure I do. His honesty surprised her. The work helps. These animals depend on me, and that gives me reason to get up each morning. He looked at her directly. What about you? What keeps you going? The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on survival, on simply making it through each day, that she hadn't considered what truly motivated her beyond necessity. My daughter, mostly, but also... She hesitated, then decided on honesty to match his own. I suppose I keep hoping there's something better waiting, something beyond just scraping by. And yet, you risked everything to help a stranger. Did I? She considered this. Or did I finally stop being afraid of taking a chance? They found the injured heifer exactly where Sarah had indicated, and Thomas's examination confirmed her suspicions, a minor sprain that would heal with rest. As they guided the animal to a smaller pen near the barn, Sarah marveled at how naturally they worked together, anticipating each other's movements without need for words. You have good instincts, Thomas observed as they secured the pen. Better than some men I've hired who claimed years of experience. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. My husband always said I had a way with animals. I just never had the chance to prove it on this scale. Well, you're proving it now. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. Sarah, Mrs. Harper, I want you to know that what you've done these past few days, I won't forget it. The way he said her name, soft and careful, sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. She found herself looking into his eyes, noting the flecks of gold in the brown, the way the cold had brought color to his cheeks. Anyone would have done the same, she said quietly. No, he replied, his voice certain. They wouldn't have. Standing there in the growing twilight, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of settling cattle, Sarah felt something shift between them, a recognition that went beyond gratitude or simple partnership. For the first time in months, the future seemed to hold possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. But today felt different. The weight of unspoken words hung between them like morning mist, growing heavier with each passing day. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed and moving with something closer to his old strength. The sight of him standing, upright, color returned to his cheeks, should have filled her with relief. Instead, it stirred something deeper, more troubling. You're up early, she said, hanging her coat on the peg by the door. Couldn't sleep. He turned from the stove where coffee was brewing, his dark eyes searching her face. Sarah, we need to talk. The words she'd been dreading. She busied herself with pulling off her gloves, avoiding his gaze. The cattle are doing well, lost another fence post on the north pasture, but nothing Tom and I can't handle. That's not what I mean, and you know it. The quiet certainty in his voice stopped her fidgeting. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Ezra, I'm not a man given to pretty speeches, he interrupted, moving closer. Never had much use for them. But these past weeks, having you here working alongside you, he paused, running a hand through his dark hair. I can't pretend it's just gratitude anymore. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd felt the shift between them too, in the lingering glances, the way his hand would brush hers when they worked over the ledgers together, the comfortable silences that spoke louder than words. "Your fever only broke 3 weeks ago," she said weakly. "You're not thinking clearly." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "My mind's never been clearer. Sarah, I know what people will say. A Mormon rancher and a widow woman who's not of the faith. But I don't care about their talk. You should." The words came out sharper than she intended. "You have a position in this community, responsibilities. My only responsibility is to my own heart. And my heart—" He reached for her hands, his calloused palms warm against her cold fingers. "My heart tells me you feel this too." She did. God help her, she did. But feeling and acting were different things entirely. "It doesn't matter what I feel," she whispered. "This can't work, Ezra. We both know it. Because of my faith? Because of everything." She pulled her hands free, wrapping her arms around herself. "Your church, your family, the whole territory, they'll never accept us." "Some won't," he admitted. "But others will. And in time—" The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Outside, she could hear Tom calling to the horses, the everyday sounds of ranch life continuing while her world tilted on its axis. "You're afraid," Ezra said finally. "Of course I'm afraid." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've been alone for 5 years, Ezra. I've built a life that's small, but it's mine, safe and lonely." The simple truth of it hit like a physical blow. Yes, lonely. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the soap he'd used, see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "I won't lie to you about the challenges we'd face, but I can promise you this: you'd never be alone again." For a moment, she let herself imagine it, waking up in this house every morning, not as hired help, but as a true partner. Building something together, weathering whatever storms came their way side by side. Then reality crashed back in. "I need time," she said, "to think." Something flickered across his face, disappointment maybe, or hurt. But he nodded. "Of course, take all the time you need." She turned toward the door, needing distance, needing air. "Sarah," his voice stopped her at the threshold. "I meant what I said, about not caring what others think. But I do care what you think, what you want. Don't let fear make this decision for you." She fled then, back into the cold morning air, her heart racing and her mind spinning. Behind her, the house that had begun to feel like home suddenly felt like a dream she didn't dare reach for. The storm that had threatened all week finally broke on Sunday morning, sending sheets of sleet against the windows of the main house. Sarah stood in the kitchen, watching ice crystals form delicate patterns on the glass while coffee brewed on the stove. She'd been living in the guest quarters for 3 weeks now, but Ezra had insisted she take her meals in the main house, a propriety that felt increasingly strained as the boundaries between employer and something more continued to blur. "Roads'll be impassable by noon," Ezra said from the doorway, his voice still rough from sleep. He'd taken to rising early to help with the morning chores, despite her protests that he needed rest to fully recover his strength. She turned, noting how the grey light from the window caught the silver threading through his dark hair. "Good thing we stocked the feed yesterday." "Good thing." He moved closer, accepting the cup she offered. Their fingers brushed as he took it, a touch that sent warmth racing up her arm. "Sarah, I've been thinking." The serious tone in his voice made her pulse quicken. Over the past weeks, she'd caught him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, but neither of them had spoken of what was building between them. The unspoken words hung in the air like smoke, visible but untouchable. About what? About Christmas. He set down his cup, turning to face her fully. "It's less than 2 weeks away." She busied herself with wiping the already clean counter. Christmas had always been difficult since Michael's death. Too many memories, too much emptiness where joy should be. "I suppose it is. The children should have Christmas here. A real Christmas." Her hand stilled. "Ezra, we've talked about this. I can't keep taking from you." You're not taking. His voice carried an edge of frustration. Do you have any idea what you've given me? Given this place? He gestured toward the window where, despite the storm, she could see the cattle clustered safely in the shelter they'd built. 3 weeks ago I was ready to lose everything. Now you're recovered and perfectly capable of managing on your own. Is that what you think this is about, the ranch? The question hung between them, charged with meaning neither seemed ready to fully acknowledge. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been preparing herself to leave once Christmas passed, to take the children and return to their small house in town. It was the practical thing to do, the proper thing. But the thought of it felt like tearing something vital from her chest. I think, she said carefully, that you're a good man who feels obligated to someone who helped him in his time of need. Ezra stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the soap he'd used and see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Obligated. Yes, Sarah, look at me. She raised her eyes to his, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Not obligation, not gratitude, but something deeper and more dangerous. I've been obligated to many people in my life, he said quietly. I've never once felt obligated to memorize the way someone laughs, or to find excuses to be in the same room with them, or to lie awake at night thinking about what it might be like to... He stopped, jaw working as if fighting for control. Ezra. His name came out as barely a whisper. I know it's too soon. I know there are proprieties to consider, and your children, and what people might say. But Sarah, what I feel for you isn't obligation. Before she could respond, the kitchen door burst open, bringing a whirlwind of cold air and her children's excited voices. Emma shook ice crystals from her hair while Tommy stamped his feet, both of them pink-cheeked, from their dash from the guest quarters. Mama, look outside. Everything's covered in ice. Emma's enthusiasm filled the sudden tension in the room. It's like the whole world is made of glass. Sarah stepped back from Ezra, her cheeks burning. I can see that. Come warm up by the stove. As the children chattered about the storm, Sarah busied herself with breakfast preparations, acutely aware of Ezra's presence across the room. When she risked a glance in his direction, she found him watching her with an expression that made her pulse stutter, patient but determined, as if he'd said what needed saying and was willing to wait for her response. The storm raged outside, trapping them all together in the warm kitchen, but Sarah felt as though she stood at the edge of a different kind of precipice entirely. Behind her lay the familiar territory of widowhood and solitude, while ahead stretched something unknown and terrifying and precious. She served breakfast with hands that trembled slightly, hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. The storm might have made the roads impassable, but she was beginning to realize there might be no safe passage back to the life she'd known before. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered pasture as Mary Catherine stood at the kitchen window, watching Samuel work with the horses. 3 weeks had passed since his fever broke, and each day brought more color to his cheeks, more strength to his movements. Yet something had changed between them, a careful distance that hadn't existed before, as if they were both afraid to acknowledge what had almost been lost. She turned back to the stove, stirring the pot of beef stew that would feed the ranch hands. The kitchen had become her domain now, though Samuel insisted on paying her wages that seemed far too generous for the work she provided. When she'd protested, he'd simply said that keeping his household running was worth more than gold, especially with Christmas approaching. Christmas. The word brought a familiar ache to her chest. Last year, she and Thomas had made plans to visit her sister in Salt Lake City. This year, she would spend it here, on Samuel's ranch, among people who had become something between employers and family. Mrs. Walsh? Rebecca's voice came from the doorway, tentative and soft. Mary Catherine turned to find the girl holding a piece of paper, her face flushed with excitement and nervousness. What is it, dear? I've been working on something for Papa, for Christmas, but I need help with the words. Rebecca approached slowly, as if afraid her request might be refused. Mary Catherine wiped her hands on her apron and sat at the kitchen table, patting the chair beside her. Show me what you have. Rebecca unfolded the paper to reveal a carefully drawn picture of the ranch house, complete with horses in the pasture and mountains in the background. At the bottom, in her careful script, she had begun writing what appeared to be a poem. "It's about how Papa got better," Rebecca explained, her finger tracing the words, "about how God sent help when we needed it most, but I can't think of how to say it right." Mary Catherine's throat tightened as she read the childish verse. The words spoke of fear and prayer, of watching her father waste away with fever, and of the woman who came to care for them all. It was innocent and heartfelt and completely devastating in its honesty. "You have a beautiful start," Mary Catherine managed. "What do you want to say next?" "There's one more thing," Rebecca said as they finished. "But I don't know if I should write it." "What's that?" Rebecca looked down at her hands, suddenly shy. "I want to say that I wish you could stay forever, that maybe God sent you to be our family, not just to help Papa get well." She looked up, her eyes wide and hopeful. "Is that wrong to wish for?" Before Mary Catherine could answer, the kitchen door opened and Samuel stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. His gaze moved from Rebecca's expectant face to Mary Catherine's flushed cheeks, and something flickered in his expression. "What are you two conspiring about?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Rebecca quickly folded the paper and pressed it to her chest. "It's a secret for Christmas." Samuel's mouth curved in the first genuine smile Mary Catherine had seen since his recovery. Ah, Christmas secrets, the most important kind. He moved to the stove, inhaling the rich scent of the stew. "Whatever you're cooking, Mrs. Walsh, it smells like heaven itself." The formal address stung more than it should have. During his illness, he had called her Mary Catherine, sometimes even just Mary in his delirium. The return to propriety felt like a wall between them, carefully constructed and deliberately maintained. "Rebecca helped with the vegetables," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "She's becoming quite the cook." "Is she now?" Samuel's eyes crinkled as he looked at his daughter. "Perhaps she'll be ready to manage her own kitchen someday soon." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Walsh has her own life to consider, Rebecca, her own plans and dreams. We can't expect her to stay here indefinitely." Mary Catherine felt something crack inside her chest. "Of course," she said quietly, "I understand." But as she returned to stirring the stew, she wondered if Samuel was trying to convince Rebecca of that truth, or himself, and why the thought of leaving this place, these people who had somehow become dear to her, felt like losing everything all over again. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and promising another storm. Inside, the kitchen filled with the awkward silence of things unsaid. The storm that had threatened for days finally broke just after dawn, bringing with it a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Sarah pressed her face to the frosted window of the main house, watching as snow whipped across the yard in violent spirals. The wind howled like a living thing, and she could barely make out the shapes of the barns through the white veil. "It's getting worse," she murmured, her breath fogging the glass. Behind her, Marcus stirred in his chair by the fire. He'd been up most of the night, his fever finally breaking around 3 in the morning. Though still weak, he insisted on staying downstairs, where he could see what was happening with the ranch. "The cattle," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "They'll need to be moved to the lower pastures before the drifts get too deep." Sarah turned from the window, her expression firm. "You're not going anywhere in this weather, and certainly not in your condition. Sarah, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." She moved to his side, placing a gentle but authoritative hand on his shoulder. "I've lived through winters like this before. The cattle will find shelter in the drawers and behind the windbreaks. They're hardier than you think." Marcus tried to rise, but his legs betrayed him, trembling from the effort. The fever had taken more out of him than he cared to admit. "Thomas and the other hands are experienced men who know this land as well as you do." Sarah's voice softened as she helped him settle back into the chair. You have to trust them, Marcus, just as you trusted me. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here was the man who commanded respect across 3 counties, forced to rely on others during one of the worst storms in years. And here was the woman who'd arrived at his door, desperate and nearly destitute, now the one offering reassurance and strength. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their exchange. Sarah opened it to find Thomas, his face red with cold and his hat caked with snow. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Whitmore," he called past Sarah, "but we've got trouble. The north fence line is down and some of the herd scattered into the canyon. If we don't get them out soon, they'll be trapped when this really hits." Marcus struggled to stand again, his jaw set with determination. "Saddle my horse." The word came from Sarah with such authority that both men turned to stare at her. She stepped forward, her chin raised. "Thomas, how many men do you need?" The foreman glanced uncertainly between Sarah and his boss. "Well, ma'am, I reckon 4 good riders could do it, but—" "You have 3 hands available?" "Yes, ma'am, but—" "Then you have your 4th. Sarah was already moving toward the coat hooks by the door. "I can ride, and I know cattle." "Absolutely not." Marcus's voice cracked with the effort of projecting authority while fighting his own weakness. "Sarah, I won't have you risking your life in this storm." "Marcus," she said quietly, "when I came here I had nothing left to lose. You gave me purpose, you gave me hope. Let me give you something in return." The wind rattled the windows as if emphasizing the urgency of the moment. Thomas shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, but knowing that decisions needed to be made quickly. Marcus stared at Sarah, seeing not the desperate widow who'd appeared at his door weeks ago, but a woman of incredible strength and determination. He thought of all the ways she'd surprised him, all the moments when her quiet competence had proven more valuable than any hired hand's labor. "Thomas," he said finally, never taking his eyes off Sarah, "you make sure she has the steadiest horse, and you don't let her out of your sight." "Yes, sir." Sarah's smile was radiant despite the gravity of the situation. She finished bundling up and moved toward the door, then stopped and returned to Marcus's chair. Without hesitation, she leaned down and pressed a quick kiss to his forehead. "We'll bring them home," she promised. As the door closed behind her, Marcus sank back into his chair, his heart hammering with an emotion that had nothing to do with his recent illness. Through the window he watched the small group of riders disappear into the swirling white, Sarah's figure barely distinguishable among them. The storm raged on, but inside the warm house, Marcus Whitmore realized that somewhere along the way, his carefully ordered world had been completely transformed by a woman who'd asked for nothing more than a chance to prove herself. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the main house as Sarah checked Jeremiah's temperature one final time. The fever had broken completely during the night, and his breathing was steady and strong. Dr. Morrison had declared him out of danger, though he'd need weeks to fully recover his strength. "You should be resting too," Jeremiah said, his voice still weak but clear. "When did you last sleep?" Sarah smoothed the quilt over his chest, avoiding his gaze. "I'm fine. The children need breakfast, and there's work to be done." "Sarah." His hand caught hers, surprising her with its warmth. For days his skin had been cold as winter stone. "Look at me." She reluctantly met his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had haunted her thoughts even when she'd feared he might never open them again. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything, for the cattle, for staying, for—" He paused, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. "For caring whether I lived or died." Heat flooded her cheeks. Anyone would have done the same. "No," he said firmly, "they wouldn't have. Most folks around here would have let the fever take me and counted it a blessing to have one less Mormon in the territory." Before she could protest, voices echoed from the front of the house. Sarah pulled her hand free and hurried to the window. Her stomach dropped at the sight of Bishop Crawford's black buggy pulling up the drive, followed by 3 other carriages she recognized from Sunday services. "Company," she said, unconsciously straightening her hair and smoothing her worn dress. Jeremiah struggled to sit up. "Help me to the chair by the window. I won't receive the bishop from my sickbed like an invalid." Against her better judgment, Sarah helped him stand and shuffle to the leather chair. He was pale as fresh snow, but his jaw was set with determination. She'd learned that expression meant arguing would be pointless. The front door opened, and Mrs. Patterson's voice carried through the house as she welcomed the visitors. Sarah heard the rustle of skirts and heavy footsteps approaching the bedroom. Bishop Crawford entered first, his wife and 2 other church ladies behind him. His pale eyes swept the room, taking in Jeremiah's weakened state and Sarah's rumpled appearance with obvious disapproval. "Brother Jeremiah," the bishop said, his tone formal, "we're grateful to see you recovering. The Lord's mercy has been abundant." "Indeed," Jeremiah replied carefully, "though his mercy worked through human hands. Mrs. Mitchell has been tending me day and night." The bishop's gaze shifted to Sarah, and she felt suddenly exposed under his scrutiny. "Yes, we've heard about Mrs. Mitchell's dedication. It's actually why we've come." Sarah's mouth went dry. She'd known this moment would arrive eventually, but she'd hoped to delay it until Jeremiah was stronger. "There's been considerable talk," Bishop Crawford continued, "about the propriety of a young widow spending so much time alone with an unmarried man, even under these circumstances." "Sarah saved my life," Jeremiah said, his voice gaining strength, "and my livestock. If there's been talk, it comes from small minds and smaller hearts. What exactly are you suggesting?" Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. The bishop clasped his hands behind his back. "We believe it would be best for all concerned if you return to your own home immediately. Mrs. Patterson and the other sisters can tend to Brother Jeremiah's remaining needs." "No." The word came from Jeremiah with surprising force. "Sarah stays." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Sarah watched emotions play across the bishop's face: surprise, anger, and something that looked like calculation. "Brother Jeremiah," he said slowly, "you're still recovering. Perhaps when your thoughts are clearer—" "My thoughts are perfectly clear." Jeremiah gripped the arms of his chair and forced himself to stand, swaying slightly. "This is my home, and I decide who's welcome in it." Sarah stepped closer, ready to catch him if he fell, but also drawing strength from his defiance of the church authority that had always intimidated her. Mrs. Crawford whispered something urgent in her husband's ear. The bishop nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Jeremiah's face. "Of course," he said finally, "your home, your decision. But Brother Jeremiah, I hope you'll consider the position this puts the church in, and Mrs. Mitchell's reputation." "I'm always thinking of Sarah's reputation," Jeremiah said quietly, but his words carried a weight that made Sarah's heart skip. "More than you might imagine." The bishop's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. Well then, perhaps we should speak again when you're fully recovered. Ladies." As the church delegation filed out, Sarah realized she was holding her breath. The sound of their carriages departing seemed to echo with finality. "You shouldn't have defied them," she said softly. Jeremiah sank back into his chair, exhausted but smiling. "Sarah, I've been thinking while lying in that bed, possibly dying. Life's too short to let other people's fears make our choices for us." The morning air bit sharp against Sarah's face as she stepped onto the porch, her breath forming small clouds in the December cold. 3 weeks had passed since the fever broke, and though Jacob grew stronger each day, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through her fingers like water through a sieve. She found him in the barn, already dressed and moving with careful deliberation as he checked the horses. The sight of him upright and working still caught her off guard. Just days ago, she'd feared she might lose him entirely. "You're up early," she said, setting down the cup of coffee she'd brought him. He straightened slowly, favoring his left side where the fever had left him weak. "Couldn't sleep. Keep thinking about what needs doing before the weather turns worse." His eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. "Been thinking about a lot of things, actually." Sarah busied herself checking the feed bins, needing something to do with her hands. "The stock are in good shape. We haven't lost a single head since the fever passed." That's not what I meant. The quiet intensity in his voice made her turn. Jacob was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part gratitude, part something deeper that made her stomach flutter. "Sarah, I need to say something, and I need you to hear me out." She felt her defenses rise instinctively. "Jacob." "No, please." He moved closer, and she could see the effort it cost him, the way he held himself carefully upright these past weeks, watching you work yourself near to death for my animals, for my land. I kept asking myself why. Why would a woman with every reason to hate men like me risk everything to help? The children needed their mother alive and well, not collapsing from exhaustion in my barn. His voice was gentle but firm. You didn't do this for them, not entirely, just like I didn't offer you work out of pure Christian charity. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The conversation was heading toward territory she'd spent weeks trying to avoid thinking about. "I should check on the cattle in the south pasture. They're fine. Bishop Morrison's boys have been helping since yesterday." Jacob stepped into her path, not blocking her exactly, but making it clear he wasn't done talking. "I've been a fool, Sarah, a proud, stubborn fool who thought he had everything figured out." She stared at the hay-strewn floor, unable to meet his eyes. "The fever made you weak. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking clearer than I have in years." His hand reached toward her face, hesitated, then gently tilted her chin up until she had to look at him. "I love you." The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of joy and terror that left her breathless. "You can't," she whispered. "I'm not. I don't fit in your world, Jacob. I'm a poor widow with nothing to offer a man like you." "A man like me?" His laugh was soft and rueful. "Sarah, I'm a lonely rancher who nearly died alone in his bed, saved only by the grace of a woman who had every reason to let me rot. If anyone doesn't fit, it's me in yours. The church elders would never." "The church elders aren't the ones who held cold cloths to my forehead and forced broth down my throat when I was too sick to swallow." His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "They weren't the ones who sang softly while they worked, thinking I was too fevered to hear." Sarah's resolve crumbled. "Jacob, I can't lose someone again. I can't survive it." "Then don't lose me." His other hand found hers, calloused fingers intertwining with her own. "Stay. Not as my employee, not as some arrangement for the children's sake. Stay because you want to, because you love me too." She did love him. The realization had crept up on her gradually over the weeks of caring for him, watching him interact with Tommy and Emma, seeing the kindness beneath his gruff exterior. But loving him and believing in a future together were different things entirely. "What about your family? The other ranchers?" "I have nothing, Jacob. No dowry, no connections, no—" "You have everything I need." He pulled her closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, smell the familiar scent of leather and soap that seemed to cling to his skin. "You have courage and strength, and a heart big enough to save a man who didn't deserve saving. That's worth more than all the cattle in Utah territory." Outside, snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes, dusting the barn windows with white. Christmas was less than a week away, and Sarah found herself thinking of gifts, the kind that couldn't be wrapped or placed under a tree, the kind that changed everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered pasture as Sarah walked beside Jeremiah toward the main house. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each step bringing her closer to a conversation she'd replayed in her mind 100 times since dawn. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, their breath creating small clouds in the crisp December air, a reminder of how this all began, with sick animals and desperate choices. "You've been quieter than usual," Jeremiah said, his voice still carrying the rasp of recent illness. "Something troubling you?" Sarah stopped walking, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. "We need to talk about what happens now." He turned to face her fully, those blue eyes that had haunted her dreams searching her face. "I've been thinking the same thing. Have you?" The words came out sharper than she intended, years of protecting herself from disappointment bleeding through. Because I've been thinking about reality, about how this, she gestured between them, how it can't work. Jeremiah stepped closer, close enough that she could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes. Why not? Because you're Jeremiah Cartwright. Her voice cracked slightly. You own half the territory. You have obligations, expectations, people who depend on you making smart decisions. And you think caring for you isn't smart? The simple question hit her like a physical blow. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite her heavy coat. I think caring for a dirt-poor widow with nothing to offer isn't practical. Your church leaders, your business partners, your family, what will they say when they learn you've taken up with someone like me? Someone like you? Jeremiah's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. You mean someone brave enough to risk everything to save a stranger's livelihood? Someone who worked day and night to nurse me back to health. Someone who's shown more grace and strength than anyone I've ever known. Someone who lives in a cabin with a leaking roof and owns 2 dresses, Sarah shot back. Someone whose husband died owing money to half the county. Someone the first love. The words hung in the cold air between them like snowflakes, delicate and transformative. Sarah felt her carefully constructed arguments crumble, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Don't, she whispered. Don't say things you'll regret when you come to your senses. Jeremiah reached for her hands, enveloping them in his warm grasp. I've never been more sensible in my life. These past weeks, watching you work, seeing your compassion, your determination. Sarah, you've shown me what real partnership looks like, what real love looks like. Tears she'd been holding back since Christmas morning finally spilled over. You don't understand. I can't be what you need. I don't know how to be a wealthy man's wife. I don't know the right things to say or do, the proper way to behave in your world. My world? Jeremiah's thumb brushed across her knuckles. Sarah, you saved my world, not just the cattle or the ranch, me. I was so focused on building an empire that I forgot what it was supposed to be for. You reminded me that wealth without love is just an empty ledger book. A laugh bubbled up through her tears, watery and uncertain. That's very poetic, but it doesn't solve the practical problems. Then let's solve them together. His voice carried a quiet intensity that made her look up into his eyes. Marry me, Sarah, not because it's practical or expected or safe, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because when I was burning with fever, your voice was what called me back. Because when I see you with the animals, with young Tom, with everyone whose life you touch, I see the woman I want to build a future with. Jeremiah. Her voice was barely a whisper. I know I'm asking you to take another risk, he continued. I know you've already lost so much. But I'm not asking you to change who you are to fit my world. I'm asking if you'll let me change my world to fit us. Sarah stared at him. This man who'd somehow seen past all her defenses to the woman she'd forgotten she could be. The wind picked up, swirling snow around their feet, but she barely felt the cold. What about your church, your business associates? Let me worry about them. Jeremiah's hands tightened on hers. The only person whose answer matters to me is yours. Standing there in the snow, surrounded by the land she'd helped save and looking into the eyes of the man she'd helped heal, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Fear would always be there. It was part of loving someone. But so was hope, and maybe, just maybe, hope was stronger. Ask me again, she said softly. Jeremiah smiled, that slow, warm smile that had first stolen her breath. Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me? The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered valley as Elizabeth stood at the window of what would soon be her home. 3 weeks had passed since Jacob's proposal, 3 weeks of planning and preparation that had transformed the grief-stricken household into something alive with possibility again. The ministers arrived, Mary called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the excitement that had been building all week. She'd thrown herself into wedding preparations with the fervor of someone who'd been waiting years for something joyful to celebrate. Elizabeth smoothed the simple blue dress she'd chosen, her finest, though it had seen better days. It seemed fitting somehow, marrying in clothes that had weathered storms, just as she and Jacob had weathered their own tempests to arrive at this moment. Jacob appeared in the doorway, his recovery evident in the steady way he moved, though she could still see traces of the illness in the careful pace he maintained. He wore a black suit she'd never seen before, and the sight of him took her breath away. Not because of his appearance, though he was handsome, but because of the way he looked at her, as if she was something precious he'd thought lost forever. "Are you certain?" he asked softly, the same question he'd posed every day since she'd said yes. "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied, and meant it completely. They'd talked through everything during his convalescence, her fears about being seen as a gold digger, his concerns about giving her children a father who might never fully replace their own. They'd discussed the ranch, the responsibilities, the way tongues would wag in town. But underneath all the practical considerations lay something simpler and more profound. They'd found in each other a kind of peace neither had expected to feel again. The ceremony was small, held in the ranch house parlor with Mary and the hands as witnesses. Pastor Williams spoke about partnership and mutual aid, about how the best marriages were built on friendship as much as passion. Elizabeth found herself thinking of David as the words were spoken, not with pain, but with gratitude. Her first marriage had taught her what love could be. This second chance was teaching her what love could become. When Jacob slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, the same ring she'd admired in the family portrait, Elizabeth felt the weight of it settle into place like a promise kept, not just to him, but to herself and her children. She was no longer a woman alone against the world. Tom and Emma stood beside Mary, their faces solemn with the gravity of the moment. They'd grown fond of Jacob during his recovery, especially Tom, who'd spent hours at the man's bedside listening to stories about cattle drives and territorial days. Emma had been won over the afternoon. Jacob had quietly helped her practice her letters, never making her feel foolish for struggling with words that came easily to her brother. "You may kiss your bride," Pastor Williams announced, and Jacob's lips were gentle against hers, a soft seal on promises spoken and unspoken. The celebration that followed was modest but warm. Mary had prepared a feast that filled the house with the sense of roasted beef and fresh bread. The ranch hands, cleaned up and awkward in their best clothes, offered shy congratulations and toasted the couple with cups of coffee liberally laced with whiskey. As afternoon melted into evening, Elizabeth found herself standing again at that same window, watching snow begin to fall in fat, lazy flakes. Jacob's arms came around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. "Regrets?" he murmured against her hair. "Only that we waited so long to be honest with each other," she said. They'd both been so afraid, he of presuming too much, she of appearing mercenary. But the fever had burned away pretense along with everything else, leaving them with only truth, that they'd found something worth fighting for in each other. "Spring will be here before we know it," Jacob said, and she heard the promise in his voice. Spring meant new calves, fresh grass, the cycle of life beginning again. It meant her children growing up with opportunities she'd never dared imagine for them. It meant a partnership that would weather whatever storms came their way. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now, no longer frightened by their power. "And I love you," he replied, turning her in his arms so he could see her face. "My Christmas miracle." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and somewhere in the kitchen, Mary was humming a half-remembered carol. Elizabeth Thornton, now Elizabeth Garrett, smiled at her husband and knew that sometimes the most unexpected gifts were exactly what the heart needed most.